Hello, everybody, and welcome to another one of these Fotospeed talks. And we're very happy to be welcoming Phil Hill. Phil, how are you?
Well, thank you.
Good.
Welcome.
Tim is with us, obviously, as usual, and myself, Sam Gregory. So Phil is a photographer, and we're going to obviously talk to him a little bit about his work and his processes as well. And he recently released a book, and he's working on some new projects as well. And generally, I think it's safe to say, Phil, you do tend to work in that sort of project style now, don't you? But that wasn't necessarily always the way. I know you used to do a lot more traveling and work on that side. So maybe give us a bit of that background and where you are now photographically.
Yeah, I guess going back to the very start, I used to shoot, travel and lifestyle for kind of airline publications mainly. So I've traveled around quite a bit. Lived in Australia for a couple of years, and I was kind of mainly doing that kind of area. And then I guess about 8 years ago now, so I came back and kind of thought, well, okay, can I continue to freelance in that style? And it just, the UK is a vastly more competitive market for that on that side of things. So I actually kind of took a step back a little bit to get into teaching, because that was always something that I kind of was really interested to do. So I moved from the most beautiful kind of set of beaches in the world to just inside the M25 in a place called Watford, Hertfordshire, which was a shock to the system, but it's actually been kind of really, really valuable for my practice, I suppose, in the long run. So yeah, so now I teach, which is where I am right now, and also kind of doing this MA and working on kind of more long form project based stuff, which really enjoying. Yeah.
So we've got some of the images that we're going to share. It might be interesting to give us a little bit of background about where they sit in particular projects. But I think just as we get to those, how obviously it's different, isn't it, working in that way to being sent out on commissions to do particular short jobs where you know exactly what you've got to go and get, and you know what that client might want from you. But in this work, you're leading that, and you're trying to engage with communities and tell those stories. So how do you go about sort of re-gearing your brain to work in that fashion?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I was so used to working in this way where basically the way the kind of those travel kind of stories would work is like they would have already had a writer gone out to these places, sometimes on like a paid kind of like junket, they call them, just to kind of, they get like a group of writers together, they send them around all these really nice places, and then the writers pitch them to the publications, and then the publication would come to me and like, right, we need some pictures. So it's almost like I had a script to follow in the sense that I knew what I had to photograph, I knew where it was going, I knew what it should look like. So when I started the MA, I was kind of very much in that mindset, and I was actually thought, right, I'm gonna go out and find. It's quite interested in community groups, so I thought, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find some kind of interesting, kind of quirky looking community groups that I can photograph, and then actually potentially I could then sell on to some of the kind of established markets that I had. But quickly realized that wasn't really going to cut it. So really started to kind of wind things back and think about research. It's like very kind of research focused now, and it feels like the higher up you go in photography education, the fewer kind of photographs you're looking at and the fewer kind of photographs you're taking initially, but obviously the ones that you do end up taking are just far better, I think. That sense.
Tim, do you want to bring up some of the images?
Yeah, I'll bring up some pictures, because I have to declare that I know Phil through we're on the same masters and the same MA at Falmouth, so I have seen Phil's work quite a bit in the last few months, and we actually did share a presentation a few weeks ago, didn't we, as well? So that's right, yeah. But I'm always intrigued by your work, Phil, so it's great to see it actually and get to talk to you about it as well. So
awesome. Yeah.
Well, where should we
Cool.
start, do we think, on these, Phil? Because I know you've had the book out recently, which was around Watford, wasn't it? And you mentioned that you're
Yeah.
living there now. So is there a couple you might want to pick up on from that?
Well, I mean, funnily enough, these pictures are not from that project, but actually, if it wasn't for that project, I wouldn't be doing this one in that sense. So, I mean, I can give a little bit of background, I suppose. So, you know, I'm from a small Somerset town originally. I just realised Fotospeed is based in Corsham. That's right,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So that's not a million miles away from where I'm from originally, which is Frome, Somerset. So, you know, but as growing up, it wasn't, you know, from fairly kind of working class background, it was, you know, low aspiration. So it's kind of quickly wanted to kind of escape that. Weirdly, since I kind of got into the travel side of things, Frome's become very gentrified, and it always kind of tops these best places to live in the UK, which I find bizarre. It's not the place that I would recognise growing up, but so like a lot of the stuff that I was doing, like with the Watford stuff, was because I kind of felt like, well, I moved away from my hometown, but I've never really truly connected to the place that I live. So it was about kind of exploring identity and kind of community and things like that. So like the images that you see here are basically me returning almost back to the kind of start in that sense. So yeah, basically I kind of wrapped up that book, which was great, and I kind of felt like I'd done kind of Watford, and I wanted to kind of look more of myself, my own identity. So what you're looking at here is like, I started looking at my family archive essentially. So there's a picture, I think it's fourth along the top row there, this kind of family album.
This one there.
Yeah. So this one triggered everything basically. So I'm there kind of going through the family archive and the family albums, and this was just before the last lockdown. So I was like, right, I'm not going to be able to get out and photograph, so I'm going to start kind of investigating my own family archive really. So I smuggled this out of my parents' house and started, you know, looking at it, and then I came across this page, and I was like, why are these photographs? Why have they been cut in half? You know, where's the other part of this image? And you know, as it turns out, so the person cut out the image is my grandmother. You know, and I haven't actually seen my grandmother for like over 20 years, and my mum and my grandmother haven't spoken for that amount of time as well. But I just came back to this kind of page in the album, and I just, you know, why cut an image and leave it there? Surely ask more questions than removing it or kind of leaving it. You know, I would have just kind of continued flicking through this album, you know. So that kind of started off, and I thought, well, I haven't spoken to my grandmother for over 20 years. The last time I did, I was kind of quite a young child, I suppose. So the only kind of story I have is fragments of kind of narrative that my mum tells me, essentially. So that kind of started me on this kind of new project, which is called Unreliable Narrator, essentially. So I'm you know, we're kind of all think of the words really, you know, all of our own kind of personal histories, the way we present ourselves, you know, it's all very biased, it's all based on perspective, it's all kind of how you wish to be presented. So, you know, we're all kind of susceptible to this idea of unreliable narration in a sense.
And I suppose that links to photography as well, doesn't it? With the unreliable, it's an unreliable practice in a way. We can easily fake it. We can easily kind of try to do something else in it.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's like, you know, the photography is unreliable. Absolutely, yeah. It's like, you know, we're so used to kind of like putting our trust and our faith in the photograph, because you think, well, what is there, what is in front of you? But actually, it's just another perspective, or, you know, what's happening outside of the frame, or, you know, the picture is like 1/1000th of a second. You know, what happened in the rest of that time? It's like, you know, so it's all kind of steeped in that kind of area, I suppose.
Once you've had that initial sort of seed of an idea, though, this curiosity about the image being cut out, and that reference to, yes, like you say, an unreliable view, or more just that there's so many other things going on. It's only ever a snapshot, isn't it? Literally and figuratively around what's happening at the time. But how do you transform that into actually going out and starting to make images? Because that's a big divide, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, so from this, I mean, there's a few more in this series that I basically started looking at these objects, and there's this idea, like in anthropological terms, I suppose, that because I've started reaching out to my grandmother, I started trying to see, I want to see what the other side, the other perspective to that story is, but I've not had a reply yet. So the only kind of evidence, I suppose, that I have are these objects. And as I say, so in anthropological terms, they use kind of artifacts and objects to kind of almost create those links, create those gaps, I suppose. And also kind of, I mean, that one's quite a good one, actually, that you just put up, Tim. So, it's all these objects that we collect and we kind of put value on. The Lloyds Bank bag is actually a bag of my hair from 1983. So that kind of like started to develop the project a little bit, because I felt like, it's almost about belief as well, and it's like elements of superstition and class, I suppose, and all these other kind of areas that kind of are I suppose constructed. It's all constructive narrative, I suppose. The St. Christopher medal was a present from my grandmother. I've always had it, but I've never worn it. And then all these other kind of christening kind of presents linked to my childhood, I suppose. So that's kind of how I've started it, and then I felt like I wanted to construct my own narrative, whether that's true or not. That is kind of not as important as me kind of just like trying to make sense of all of these objects and members of my family, I suppose. So that's when I've started to kind of go back and create portraits. And I'm still in the process of working on this project. So hopefully, fingers crossed for a break in the weather, I'm looking to kind of start kind of introducing place and more portraiture into that as well.
And so with some of because there are a few portraits, aren't there, in the images you've sent us? So are these members of the family, or that relate to certain parts of that backstory, or what's the situation? And introducing people is a difficult part of it, isn't it, versus objects, and you know what I mean? That transition.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. So these are all members of my family, or extended family, basically. So and then what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to like sort of construct this kind of story around this, and as a starting point, I'm almost describing what I see in the picture, and maybe kind of a story behind that, I suppose. So so there's my dad in the middle at the top there. So that's basically my dad. He's retired now in the garden. That's kind of what he was doing. But also there's like this nice juxtaposition to one of the other images I shot. I can't remember if I sent it to you, but there's like a garden incinerator. I don't know if it looks like a rusty old bin.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah. So the rusty old bin is for garden waste, but my parents actually use it for destroying documents. So I kind of like this juxtaposition of my dad in the garden. Is he in the process of doing that, I suppose? And then it kind of bringing in that kind of unreliable narrator, a little bit more, and I'm thinking about topics around kind of misinformation, and again it's about belief and things like that. My family are very they would have beliefs, I suppose, that like many people would find strange. Around the pandemic, for instance, they're quite skeptical about kind of areas of that which you would consider conspiracy. I feel like it's fueled out of this idea of like misinformation, or other unreliable narrators kind of feeding kind of these stories, basically.
So Phil, with that in mind, this is one of the challenges with the photographic medium, isn't it? As to, you're aware of all of these things and they're driving your work. When it comes to the final, well, when does a project end? That's always a difficult one. And B, some of these great, linking parts you're telling us, yes, the viewer may bring some of those and may pick up on some of those threads visually, but how important is it that when the work's presented, there is, how much of that do you share both in words or in, when you're presenting it, what I'm trying to say, how much of that remains unknown versus how much do you offer of that?
Yeah, I think the more and more I'm studying photography now, the more I'm like distancing myself from like the actual matter of fact or truth or the value that it has as a kind of document. I suppose I'm more interested in creating these kind of fictionalized kind of areas around it, and I'll try and contextualize that a little bit. And I think through some of the kind of areas I've mentioned to you guys, those things, those are essentially true, all those things. But however, how kind of they work together is a construction, isn't it? And again, the way I put that together is based on my personal kind of bias and history. And but I totally kind of accept that someone will come along and be like, well, it's not that, Phil, it's this. And I think again that really kind of supports the idea of the unreliable narrator, I suppose.
Well, yeah, as viewers, we're going to be looking at the prints or the book and going, oh, well, the chap in the middle, we'll make up our own story, won't we? We'll make up our own narrative in our head and become unreliable in that sense because it's not the true story. And we just naturally do that, I think, as even if we know the person, we're going to be, we'll make up a tangent that we have a view of that person, I suppose, as well, don't we? So
yeah, I hope so. I mean, I don't want to kind of misrepresent anyone here. Obviously, they're my family, and I care about everybody here. But yeah, no, I completely kind of I cannot own the kind of narrative in that sense. It's yours to kind of construct as much as it's mine, I suppose.
So how do you approach when you're asking people if you can make their photograph? And I'm even thinking about how I word that because I know that's a hot topic. But how do you approach that with? And with certainly members of the family that might be different, not necessarily easier. But because when someone allows you to do that, they are putting a trust in you to some degree. And how much of that project are you sharing? Because it's still very much developing in your own mind as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I did the Watford's work, that was about kind of me connecting with people in my community. That was, so it's a very straightforward conversation about, this is what this work is about and what it's for. I think my family, obviously, it's very personal. I'm still kind of, as you say, developing the work. So I'm having conversations with them. They are kind of aware of what I'm doing and kind of why I'm doing it. Very, very kind of happy for me to photograph them, I think. And I think the important part is when I come to actually finalize and sequence this work and actually say, like, this is kind of the message we're putting out there. I think it'd be very important to kind of work with them so that they are aware of what, how their representation is being contextualized, I suppose.
Would you ask them? I know there are photographers out there that would, like photographer Nan Golding, she famously would ask the people if they liked the picture before she would publish it and things like this. Would you be happy if they didn't quite like the picture? Would you still go ahead, or would you work with them to try and kind of?
I know, there's I mean, as you can tell from this set, there's not a portrait of my mum yet, and I'm not sure how kind of on board she is with all of the elements yet. But I think you're right. I want everybody involved to be kind of have that kind of dialogue with them, and if they're not happy, then yeah, I would try and kind of let's work together and see if we can kind of make that more a faithful representation, I suppose. I mean, I don't think it would be fair of me to kind of put a picture out there that you know, any member of my family or anyone I photograph is really unhappy with, to be honest.
I suppose you're. Sorry, I was just going to say, it's almost like with the photographs, you're when you're photographing them. For me, anyway, I kind of get this impression that you're almost asking them to be disconnected from their self, I suppose, in that way, in their own narrative in their heads themselves as well, I suppose. Kind of, do they see it like that, or do you see it like that?
I think, you know, I'm still working on how much of myself I put into the project as well, actually. And I think like I could either do it kind of really obviously by having like a picture of me in the work, or I kind of like I apply my authorship to the pictures, I suppose. So when I'm kind of making my portraits, I do pose people. I do kind of like talk to them about how maybe you could look, or how you could kind of how we interact with the camera. I think like people naturally go into a kind of certain mode when the camera's put in front of you. I'm not sure there's any such thing as a completely kind of objective, natural portrait, really. I suppose, apart from like completely candid, but yeah, I think, you know, my authorship is kind of how I can construct and pose these portraits, in a sense. Not sure if that answers your question.
Well, how now you're working in this way, Phil, you know, it's quite a different approach to what you were doing commercially beforehand. If we just, as we sort of come towards the last couple of questions, I suppose, what's your relationship with photography like now in your life? Is it much more deep-seated than it was, or is that just a simplified way for me to approach this? Because I just imagine when you're getting involved in these projects, there's an awful lot of time and thought going on in the background. You're doing other things, you might be washing up, you're probably thinking about it, you know. And photography has become even more of a thing that probably takes your mind over. But how do you see that relationship now for yourself with photography?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because when I was freelance, you know, it was about, you know, what can I do to kind of pay my bills, I suppose, you know, and that sometimes meant photographing for like the West Australian Business News, which is like the driest kind of like men in suits in front of PowerPoint presentations, but it paid the bills, you know. It was that kind of that thing. So for every kind of travel kind of magazine, there was like 10 West Australian Business News things, you know. But now, you know, because obviously I teach, that's where I derive most of my income. So that pressure is kind of off, and then I can just focus on practice and craft. And you know, and it actually meant that I've switched back to kind of using film again, which I absolutely love using. You know, and it's longer, it's kind of drawn out, I can think stuff through much more clearly. And I think obviously the MA really kind of helps that, because it puts you in that position where you need to think about what you're doing in terms of like contextualizing it and things like that. But yeah, I don't think I can almost kind of come back from that now. I think I really enjoyed the process. I think that's the kind of key thing, is when you're a commercial photographer, you're kind of outcome focused. Whereas now it's kind of it's process, and where I end up is you know, it will be a nice bonus, I suppose.
Yeah, and you don't always know where you're going to end up. I suppose that's the fun part. Tim, any just final questions before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I know that I did want to point out though, but you actually found the other half of this picture, didn't you, in the album?
Oh yeah,
oh,
I
cool.
did. Yeah,
that was that. Yeah,
which is
so actually
this
first one. Yeah. So when I was, I'm still kind of picking my way through this. Still picking my way through this archive. You know, like my parents' archive is patchy. Some of it's like bags of negatives that have been in the attic since the early 80s. So and I found the negative, and that's kind of what triggered this whole process, because I was like, who is that? Who got cut out of this picture? And yeah, it's my grandmother essentially. So the picture on the left is part of an experiment I did around that. So I actually rephotographed the negative onto black and white film, and then it's actually been printed out onto I don't know if you can see it, but it's like a letter writing. It's got the letter writing watermark on there.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And Bond. Sorry, one of your competitors probably, but
I'll bleep it out, Phil. Don't worry.
Other papers are available. But I just like the idea of like having that correspond. I'm trying to, reach out and connect again with my grandmother. Through kind of maybe writing my own letters and things like that. And I have these memories of a very kind of, it's of its time, this kind of that letter writing material. So I was trying to explore through that. And if I can't actually get the other side of the story, then maybe I can kind of present it kind of visually somehow. I don't know if that's possible, but it'd be interesting to see if I can, I suppose.
Cool. Well, listen, I think Tim, we need to make sure we get Phil back on when the project's complete, and maybe I would imagine it will end up in book form. That's probably the idea, Phil, is it?
That's where I'm going for. Yeah, I've been working through some. I'm working through some kind of dummies myself actually, and I met with a book designer actually, just to see what was possible. Only yesterday actually, which was really positive. So hopefully I can do something with that. And
I know we're talking paper, Phil, aren't we? So
yes. I've been talking to you guys about your matte duo papers as well. Which is,
but these things need to live, don't they? And they need to come out. And that's where the printing, even if you're looking at contact sheets or looking at prints to sequence, I mean, that's a whole other conversation for another day. But having the tangible thing in front of you is really helpful, isn't it? With that,
I'm really into that now. Actually, the tangibility, physicality of the photograph, and actually, I think lots of elements of this project actually really lean towards kind of actually having a tangible object.
It's like the family album, isn't it? You're going to open it. You're going. It's that idea, I suppose. It's
that's where it all started.
I've had an up and down relationship with photo books, but I think I love them. I love collecting them myself, but sometimes I feel like they can be quite, because you're only ever going to produce like maybe 100 photo books, and like that in terms of kind of sharing your message, that's not massive. But actually now the piece I make with it is like, well, that's your staging post for bigger and kind of wider things, isn't it? And as I say, the physical kind of aspect of the photo album needs to be part of this project, I think.
Yeah,
I agree.
Cool. Well, look, listen, Phil, we thank you very much for your time. It's great to get a bit of an insight into how you work and how you think. And I think it's really fascinating that your relationship with the photography obviously changes massively when you're approaching it in different ways and for different reasons. And I do fear always that's the hardest thing, isn't it? Is to make something meaningful, and that is very difficult if you're being lent on for other commercial reasons. So there's an obvious problem there generally within the photography world. But we wish you the best for everything going forward, and we will definitely get you back on, hopefully, to look at the end product. That would be neat to do a retrospective on it. But for today, we'll say thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, obviously, for joining us as well and for connecting us up with Phil. That's cool.
Yeah, and, thank you, Phil.
And we'll speak to you all again very soon. Cheerio for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.